Good morning or good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you are joining us from. I'm Caitlin Nardozzi, the marketing manager at Gruyter. We still have a few people logging in, so we're going to give them a minute to get settled and then we'll get underway. Okay, I think it's about 1 p.m. So I think we're going to get started. Thank you for joining us for today's panel discussion and Q&A, the University Press eBook acquisition, a Q&A session with stakeholders. Before I introduce our moderator, I would like to cover a few housekeeping topics. Today's webinar is being recorded. We will be able to share a link with you after the event is complete. We welcome you to revisit the content and share it with your colleagues. We also invite your comments and questions. So please look at the Q&A chat box on your screen. If you think of a question at any point, just type it in there to both the panelists and attendees, and we will pose questions to the panelists during the Q&A portion of the event. The webinar will end at 2 p.m. today. If there are any unanswered questions at that point, we will be in touch directly. Today's moderator is Steve Fallon. Steve Fallon is Vice President, Americas and Strategic Partnerships at Gruyter. Steve helped to establish Gruyter's partner program with the signing of our first press, Harvard, in 2012. Currently, he manages Gruyter's Americas office and the global partner program of 28 publishers. At this time, I am going to hand the floor over to Steve. Steve, it's all yours.
Great, thanks, Caitlin. Appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Q&A session. Really appreciate this opportunity to have this exciting dialogue about the University Press eBook acquisition for academic libraries with our panelists who represent our scholar community quite well, coming from library, consortia, press, and service provider. But also, this community is also made up of all of you. So it's really important that we have this dialogue together, and thank you for attending. First, some housekeeping notes. Because we're doing this in a virtual environment and because we're doing a Q&A session, we want to make sure you have the opportunity to follow along with what we're doing. So what we've done is we've asked Anne Varghese, who's the marketing manager for our partner program, and we'll have sent the Q&A, a summary of our Q&A, all of our questions to your email. We had trouble posting it in the chat. So if you would like to follow along with our Q&A session, please check your email, take a look at that document, and yeah, you have a sense of the direction that we're going to go in. We only have an hour, so I'm going to be very mindful of the time and may need to interject. We have a lot of topics that we want to discuss, and most importantly, we want to get to hearing from our audience as well. The themes that we're going to cover in this session are four of them. It's the impact of transformative events from 2020, the need for collaboration between stakeholders, the low-use scholarly monograph, and sustainability. At the end of those themes, we'll have a lightning round, and we have a team that will pay attention to the chat. So in the chat, you have two opportunities to send a question. One is to all panelists, to all the panelists only, and one is to all the attendees and the panelists. Ideally, you send a question to the panelists and the attendees. That gives everyone a chance to know what questions are being asked. However, it's more important that you ask questions, and if you're less comfortable doing that, and you just want to send the question to the panelists, that's fine too. We have a team that will be paying attention to those questions, who will be calling them together and providing them for us at the end for the lightning round. Next, I'd like to introduce our panelists from my left into your right. First, I'd like to introduce Curtis Brundy. Curtis is the Associate University Librarian for Scholarly Communications and Collections at Iowa State University. Next is Patrick Carr. Patrick is the Program Manager for Library Consortium Operations for the Connecticut State Colleges and University Library Consortium. Next is Patrick Alexander. Patrick Alexander is the Director at Penn State University Press. Also joining us is Paige Clunie. Paige Clunie is a Digital Sales Associate at Harvard University Press, and John Elliott. John is the Vice President for Sales for GOBI Library Solutions. Thank you all for joining us, and let's get into the session. Our first topic was transformative events. This is a new normal for all of us, and I think we'd be remiss if we did not take a moment when we talk about ebook acquisitions in this new normal to just address what's been happening. There's two significant developments over the past year that have transformed our world, both COVID-19 and the protests for social and racial justice. How have these events impacted your consortia, library, or press? And Patrick Carr, I'd like to start with you.
Thank you, Steve, and I'm happy to be part of today's panel. So, both of those events have had tremendous impacts in numerous ways. And so I thought maybe I would just focus my response on a couple of outcomes in my consortium that are particularly tied to ebooks and ebook acquisition. So I'll start by saying that the Connecticut State colleges and university system, so that consists of 12 community colleges, 4 state universities, and Charter Oak State College. The system and its libraries have long had a strong commitment to advancing equity. While Connecticut is a relatively wealthy state, wealth and mobility are inequitably distributed. And racial inequities in Connecticut are illustrated by the fact that we have one of the highest post-secondary achievement gaps between white and non-white students in the country. And the libraries in my consortium work hard to provide resources and services that will help break down those barriers. So the protest that occurred in response to the deaths at the hands of the police of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other incidents reflecting systemic racism have sort of further underscored that commitment to advancing equity. In my consortium, we recently finalized a strategic plan, and we've really placed equity at the center. And we're trying to look at everything that we do through that lens of equity. My consortium recently carried out a CSCU system-wide acquisition and setup of through ProQuest to the Wiley book, From Equity Talk to Equity Walk, expanding practitioner knowledge for racial justice and higher education. And this acquisition is associated with system-wide workshops related to the book that will be occurring later this spring and into the fall, including a workshop to be led by the book's lead author. But then just sort of taking a step back to note the impacts of COVID-19 in general. Another thing I wanted to mention before yielding the floor is the increasing importance of providing remote access to library resources and the importance of libraries partnering together to achieve this outcome. One project that I'm proud of is that my consortium carried out last spring involved my consortium working with the University of Connecticut, which is the one state institution of higher ed that's not part of my consortium. So CSCU system and UConn work together to collaboratively acquire university press collections through the Gruyter. And this is the first kind of acquisition like this, where UConn and the CSCU system have worked together. And it's enabled us to acquire collections of scholarly monographs in a way that leverages our collective buying power and that gave all students at publicly funded institutions of higher ed Connecticut permanent access to university ebook collections. So again, this is a huge topic, and I'm sure my fellow panelists probably have a lot more to say on it.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. Curtis, would you like to?
Yeah, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I will just echo what Patrick has said. Very similar COVID impacts, budget reductions, 6.7% collections cut for us this year. We're getting 5% next year. Move to campus, just jumping into 100% online with our classes means, we were very concerned about that remote access. So Iowa State has never, we've been still buying a lot of print. So this was a good prompt for us to really shift directions toward ebooks. So, we made big investments, both with the de Gruyter University Press, and not trying to shill for that, but that was something that was available to us. We want to support the university presses. This was one way of doing that. But we're also going direct. We're supporting, what MIT Press is doing, what Michigan is doing, and what Duke is doing direct. in thinking about, the social and racial justice piece of that and everything that happened over the summer, I think like most institutions, diversity, equity, inclusion was already very much front and center in what we were doing, but this is even accelerated and emphasized the need for advancing across all of that. Just one thing I wanted to mention that we're doing in the area of collections in regards to this is, like many libraries, we have probably a long-standing and more outdated than it needs to be collection development policy that, ours probably doesn't look much different than it did 20 years ago. We just completed in the fall a review of that policy, looking at it through the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're going to not so much rewrite that document as we're going to completely re-envision what that document needs to be in order to bring us toward a collection that is representative of the people and the voices, in our community. And I don't think that's where our collection is today. So we have a lot of work to do. But that's one project that's a direct outcome of everything that happened over the summer. And yeah, and I'll stop there, Steve.
Thanks. And from a press perspective, Patrick Alexander?
Yeah, thanks very much for the opportunity to participate in this panel. COVID-19 had a profound effect and continues to have a profound effect upon the Penn State University Press. We began working remotely like almost everybody else in March of 2020, mid-March, and we haven't stopped. A second factor for us, because we handle our own distribution and fulfillment, from mid-March until 1 July, our warehouse was closed and we were unable to fulfill orders. And it had a concrete financial negative impact on us for about $500,000. And as the pandemic impact upon libraries became clearer to us, we responded by offering our temporary access to our books through the Internet Archive site. And then in the middle of the pandemic, we launched a new trade imprint called Graphic Monday, which is devoted to graphic novels dealing with issues of environment, social justice, gender, health, human rights, race, and science. And the title that launched the series was in fact called COVID Chronicles, which is a comics anthology, including contributions of more than 60 artists and authors. A portion of the proceeds were directed to the Book Industry Charitable Foundation, known as BINC, which supports out-of-work artists and writers. As it became apparent that print was no longer the preferred method of delivery, the press quickly, well, as quickly as we could, pivoted to expand our eBook assets, increase the channels through which we distribute those, and we sought ways to increase the dissemination of e-content generally. The battle for racial and social justice is at the heart of the press's commitment to equity, diversity, inclusivity, and accessibility. Our university fostered greater understanding and offered resources for further implementing the values of EDIA in the wake of the horrors of George Floyd's, Breonna Taylor's, and others' useless deaths. Within the press itself, our publications reflect the commitment with titles like Kenyan, Christian, and Queer, Religion, LGBT, Activism, and Arts of Resistance in Africa, or Banning Black Gods, Law and Religion of the African Diaspora. The latter offers a thought-provoking study of the socio-legal realities for adherents and practitioners of African-derived religions and the grounds on which legal protections are either offered or denied. Our publication, After Gun Violence, Deliberation and Memory in the Age of Political Gridlock, offered insights into the role of public memory in shaping the discourse, showing how memories of victims of gun violence, the Second Amendment, and race relations influence how gun policy is discussed. Author Craig Rood offers a new approach to communicating about these events. Finally, the financial impact of COVID-19 upon our university and our press meant cutting expenses, a hiring freeze, and striving to creatively maintain connected with our authors, vendors, clients, and customers. I'm sure many of you can share these kinds of experiences in the pandemic and in the midst of all the racial and social injustice that's taking place.
Great, thank you. Thank you, all of you. I think in hearing your answers, I guess maybe it would be best to summarize this is that you've had to I guess now what the 3 Ps of you had to pivot as an organization to prioritize and also partner. And I think that is that's a good segue into our next topic. The next 3 topics can be best summed up from a quote of a session that was held in Charleston in 2013. That session was a session of stakeholders, much like it is like we have here today, that included a press director, an ARL librarian, a vice provost from an ARL library, and the executive director from the Association of University Presses. The session was called University Presses and Academic Libraries Demystified, a Conversation. And I'd like to read a quote of what one of the panelists, Angela Carreño. For those of you that work with Angela, you'll know that she's a staunch advocate of university presses. She's been talking about a lot of her topics for many years and played a large role in a lot of the developments that we've seen, not only with our company, but also with NYU and their support across all aggregators for university presses. Angela, in her role as the head of collection development library for NYU, said the following: when it comes to that low-use scholarly monograph, I think it's very important to partner with university presses in understanding what sustainability means. It is odd because we know so little about each other. The presses have no idea what we buy and do not know about our metadata pains and how that ties in with discovery. And we have no idea how they figure out their business model or how they come up with the price of an ebook. And yet we have to come together and figure out sustainability. I really believe that the dialogue is long overdue. And that was in 2013. I'd like to unpack Angela's astute assessment and talk about 3 important areas. One is this idea of the library press collaboration. Second is the low-use scholarly monograph. And then the third is sustainability. Starting with the first question, as I mentioned, this session happened in 2013, 7.5 years later. Do you think that the academic library and university press collaboration has improved? Do presses and libraries work more closely together? If so, can you please explain? If not, what do you see are the challenges and what improvements would you like to see? First, I'd like to ask that to Paige. Paige?
Thanks, Steve. So I've been working on the ebook and library side for around the past 5 years. And because we don't host our own ebooks or sell directly, the collaboration between presses and libraries is for us primarily facilitated by this vendor aggregator partnerships like through Gruyter and EBSCO and ProQuest, since they have access to data and trends and pricing that, desires that we just simply don't have access to. And I would say over the past couple of years, there's been a huge improvement on the data we're being provided by these vendors, and advancements in technology have improved metadata and discoverability, and just the level of data that as a press we're able to receive from the libraries by means of via the aggregators. And we understand that, of course, library needs are not uniform. And as Curtis mentioned earlier, many libraries will now be revisiting their collection strategies. So we're looking forward to hearing, from De Gruyter and others, how the libraries have, needed to pivot and shift, and how we can participate and have flexibility in participating in different models. But it is the aggregators and the vendors that are fielding this feedback from the libraries and relaying to us. Of course, at the start of COVID, we were hearing frustrations that the libraries have when content is not available digitally. We've, for many years now, have had ongoing backlist ebook conversion projects, but at the start of COVID, we ramped up those timelines, we prioritized, we shifted resources last spring as students and faculty moved remote. We have a very large scale 2,000 title project that we are undergoing right now that we'll make available to libraries, and also understanding the importance of revisiting titles for accessibility. So titles that were converted in 2010 as PDF image scans, we are now revisiting those scans to make them accessible and OCR'd, and provide those to libraries as well. Another, helpful thing has been participating in the vendor partner programs that started at the beginning of the pandemic, and receiving feedback from those, and getting data on those programs have been very useful for us. Of course, the ongoing challenge is evergreen, which is a delicate balance of predictable and sustainable revenue stream, balanced with offering all of our titles as widely as possible to libraries within reason. So improvement comes from conversations like these, continued dialogue at Charleston, and then willingness on both sides, and then with our partners to experiment with new models.
That's great. Thank you, Paige. John, you're in a unique perspective when it comes to this topic of library press collaboration as a service provider. Can you speak to this a little bit?
Sure. And thanks again for having me on the panel today, Steve. Yeah, I guess I would echo what Paige has said, in that the communication and collaboration between libraries and publishers often does flow through a distributor like GOBI or other ones out there. And what we spend a lot of time really trying to facilitate that communication. And I think, to answer the question, has this improved over the period of the 7 years, 6.5, 7 years that you mentioned, Steve? I would say the evidence that it has is just the proliferation of options and models that are available now versus what were available when Angela made that quote. I think back then we certainly facilitated DDA, and we had publisher and aggregator platforms that were on GOBI, enabling libraries to purchase E and P in one place. But we probably had less than a dozen platforms, and now we have upwards of 30 in addition to university press platforms. So commercial presses, trade presses, and university press platforms, as well as aggregators, of course, like EBSCO and ProQuest, and JSTOR, Muse, and most recently de Gruyter. So I think the fact that so many university presses have begun to offer so many more options for libraries to discover, acquire, learn about content in a variety of ways is evidence that dialogue has continued and that things seem to be improving since Angela made that quote.
Great, thanks, John. Appreciate that. Curtis, could you talk about the perspective from an ARL library?
Sure. And I think I bring a little bit of a unique perspective to this, in that Iowa State's been extremely active in the open access space on the journal side. So when I think about, library press, collaboration and relationships, it's hard not to compare it and think about it in that context. And in that context, what we have seen on the journal side are those relationships moving from a transactional relationship where libraries are simply buying this content to relationships where we really are collaborating and we're working on, open access business models. Really, I've told people, in my last 2 years, the relationships I've developed with, societies, university presses, and publishers on the journal side are unlike anything I have had like in the preceding, 8 or 9 years that I've been a librarian. What I have seen on the book side is that collaboration is the most rich, the most, I think, impactful in the areas where we're talking about open access. And so MIT Press wants to develop, they roll out direct to open. In the development of that model, they stand up a library advisory board. Why is it important that they have that? Well, it's important for them to have it because they're doing something new. And so to the extent that the university presses are really going to try and do something new, I think that these relationships are just critical. And I would recommend any university press that does not either have a library advisory board or does not have direct contact with people like me, as you're thinking about, heading down a path of doing something new, I think you need to figure out how to do it. I think in my position, because I'm out there and it's external quite a bit, like I am having these conversations with university presses, but I have a feeling most librarians probably feel pretty detached and still in a transactional relationship if it's mediated through GOBI, if it's mediated through de Gruyter. So I would say there's probably a lot of work to be done in this space around enriching these collaborations if we really want to try and transform this space the way that we're transforming things, I feel like right now on the journal side. And I think we are going to talk a little more about open access a little bit later, and I have some other things I'm looking forward to saying on that topic. Thanks, Steve.
Sure, and just as a follow-up question, Curtis, because you mentioned earlier, the work that you've done with us, as well as the work you've done specifically with 3 presses that have their own platform, Michigan, Duke, and MIT. So my follow-up question is, that wasn't about open access. That was obviously you were making an investment into the current into the current output from these presses into the current titles. And so my question to you is, I mean, that's a clear delineation, isn't it, for presses that either have their own platform and they do not. And so from your perspective of where you sit, having access to presses that have their own platform, you know, that have either a library team, a library sales team, a digital team, as opposed to presses that have set up in a different infrastructure. You know, there's 130 plus university presses with the AUP. My question to you is, you know, what are you learning from what's needed? I mean, when we talk about this community and stakeholders, what's needed for these other libraries that don't, other presses that don't have the means for that direct access?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I certainly don't want to suggest that like GOBI is not important in trying to scale this thing up. I think it's absolutely important. It's not possible for Iowa State to have, you know, a high level of collaboration with every single university press out there, right? But we're a very broad and deep and diverse library community, just as we are on the university press side. So I think there's room for those type of relationships up and down the size and shape, scale of libraries and presses. So where the platforms fit in, you know, this is all actually still a little bit new for us. We've just really ramped up these investments, you know, mostly over the last 12 months, but I would say for the last 2 years. I'm interested in seeing what happens with the platforms. And Steve, I don't have too much more to say about that. I guess I would like to see press partnerships across these platforms. I actually was on a call with the folks at Michigan yesterday and asked them about that. What is the potential for their platform to be used by other presses? Makes a lot of sense for us if we have a relationship with Michigan using Fulcrum, that we're not just getting Michigan, that we're actually getting, you know, quite a number of presses, just like we're getting quite a number of presses from the Gruyter platform.
Thank you, thank you, Curtis. Hopefully my audio, I'll try to speak a little louder if my audio has come across muffled, so I've gotten some feedback about that. The next topic is the low-use scholarly monograph. You know, for the purpose of this panel discussion, I took a stab at trying to define the term that Angela used of the low-use scholarly monograph. So in its current form, I think it means something different to all stakeholders. And I've defined the monograph, if you will, as a specialized monograph whose individual unit sales are not self-sustaining for a university press. The monograph's scholarly contribution is disproportional to its financial assistance. With that definition in mind, I will ask 4 separate questions to a press, library, consortium, and service provider on the low-use scholarly monograph. The first is to Patrick Alexander. Patrick, in your fall-winter season of 2020, Penn State University Press published more scholarly monographs than Books on Trade or your Eyes and Browns imprint. How do you reconcile your mission of publishing rigorous, high-quality works of scholarship with demand? Also, can you speak to any trends at Penn State for scholarly monographs over the last 7 years?
Thanks, Steve. You know, in keeping with Penn State University's own mission and stated commitment to the arts and humanities, publishing low-use scholarly monographs really remains essential to our mission to identify and nurture groundbreaking research and to verify the integrity of that research in the peer review process, and then to disseminate that new knowledge in the disciplines globally. With library budgets under pressure, monograph purchases over the last 7 years have dropped precipitously. And our publishing strategy has been completely revamped. Books like revised dissertations have become extremely difficult for us to publish. And I think for any publisher, that means we're also forced to have smaller print runs, which means higher costs, and which unfortunately means higher prices. We're more sensitive to the financial realities of some projects and simply can't take some projects on because they're just so economically unviable. We're printing more books outside the US to try and realize savings costs. We've elected to print a few monographs on demand in an attempt to keep our costs down. And since 2013, we've worked to try and better understand what our library colleagues want and need. Tools like Publishers Alley have helped as well as the improved communication with vendors that John mentioned earlier. We try to pay attention to what libraries are collecting by monitoring Pub Alley, and we follow library trends such as increased reliance upon interlibrary loan, how libraries are experimenting with new collection models such as collective collections or shared collections. And of course, libraries shifted to digital books and we had to follow their lead. As publishers, we live or die by the accuracy of our metadata. We are working to find ways to respond to these trends. Plus, with the pandemic, as noted earlier, digital access is critical. And this means more than simply creating an EPUB file or a PDF. These days, it's all about accurate, timely, and comprehensive metadata that can be distributed to dozens and dozens of potential users, channels, and resellers from GOBI to Amazon to Kobo and Overdrive. So we're really seeing the trends accelerate, and we're trying to be as responsive as possible, as I think every publisher is in pretty much the same situation.
Yeah, and your points about discovery, access, and immediacy. These are topics I wish we could dive into a little bit deeper, because these changes that you're making to influence, hopefully more unit sales are really important. And I'll try to touch on that a little bit later when we talk about sustainability. Curtis, for Iowa State University, generally we're talking to university presses about the specialized monograph in humanities and social sciences, and we hear a lot about the overwhelming impact of STM. For ISU, where does the low use scholarly monograph rank in your priorities?
Yeah, and I was kind of puzzling a little bit on how to, answer that. It's kind of a politically charged question, right? Because we're a STEM heavy institution, and yet, it's certainly the library's intention to, support to the best that we can across all of the disciplines. And we in no way, shape, or form, rank out, how we're going to do, whether it's chemical engineering or political science or whatever you might have. I will just say that we hear from our humanities and social science faculty that this content's important to them, and we want to provide, the greatest access that we possibly can, like in this time of austerity.
Thank you, Curtis. And Patrick mentioned earlier, CSCU works with 18-member libraries. You now have talked about the partnership, the need for partnership due to COVID with University of Connecticut. With varying degrees of research intensity across all of those libraries, what do you feel is how do you manage the low use scholarly monograph?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and maybe kind of like Curtis, I was kind of puzzling how to answer this one. So my perspective is someone who works in a library consortium that includes many libraries that are community colleges with lower research intensivity, and certainly these are not libraries that are comprehensive collectors of materials. So thinking about it from that perspective, I think we should be exploring if there are sustainable models, both of course from the library and publisher perspective, for empowering more students with access to high quality monographs. For the community colleges, these many first generation college students and or students from minoritized groups who may not otherwise have access to these valuable resources. And low use scholarly monographs, I think, and sometimes that basically means very technical or specialized topics. But I nevertheless think that we shouldn't assume that those resources wouldn't be relevant, valuable, useful to the students and faculty who teach at institutions with a lower research intensivity.
Thank you, Patrick. And John, GOBI has a unique position of working with all aggregators in this landscape. Therefore, obviously you have access to a lot of data. From not only single title purchases, but demand-driven models, as well as collection-based sales. What are the trends that you're seeing and about how publishers manage it and how aggregators manage it? What are the trends that you're seeing when it comes to the scholarly monograph?
Well, it essentially, we're, as you mentioned, Steve, we do want to be able to provide and surface that all types of material, and clearly it can be more of a challenge to get to the type of material you're talking about now with the low use scholarly monograph. We work with, a lot of this really starts with our profiling methodology. And so before all of these previous access models that we've talked about, various formats that are available, we're trying to discover this material and make it discoverable to libraries that we work with. We work with about 2,700 libraries across the US and Canada, including, as Patrick said, about, I would say, 1,400 or so are community colleges, and then the remaining 1,300 would be four-year and graduate degree granting institutions. We also work with 1,600 approval presses, and more than 200 of those are university presses. And when we say approval presses, those are presses where we at GOBI commit to profile, book in hand or book on screen when the title is published, whichever is going to be first, all of their content for a given publication year, including what would be a low use scholarly monograph. So the profiles themselves are really designed to try to get at that material in a given instance for a given library. I do think, again, as it seems to be a bit of a trend that we've been talking about, is as the acquisitions landscape has really shifted in the last 2 years, year and a half plus with the pandemic, these models that are out there now, and things like what Gruyter's doing, JSTOR, et cetera, with DDA and what the aggregators, EBSCO and ProQuest are doing with DDA, they enable a lot more of this content, I think, to be discoverable than previously was possible. Just in terms of that shift, I thought it might be interesting. You mentioned the data. Interesting when you look at calendar year 2019 versus calendar year 2020. And you look at what the impact of, a pre-pandemic year versus basically 3/4 of a pandemic, a year in which 3/4 of the year was we're experiencing a pandemic. The mix of trade and university press units that we sold didn't change at all. About 66% of what we sold, this is individual titles, whether they're ERP, were trade, and 34% were university press. But of course, as many of my colleagues on the panel have discussed, the shift in the format for those sales was quite dramatic, right? So in 29, I thought it might be interesting. I know many of you've seen some of these statistics already in a variety of different forums, but in 2019, calendar year 2019, 79% of titles that were trade titles were print that we sold. 21% were E. So that's for trade titles. For university press titles, 16% of the titles that we sold in 2019 were ebooks, and 84% were print. So quite a difference between the two different types of presses. Flash forward through 2020, so data that through the entire calendar year of 2020, and you can see obviously the impact that 40% of our trade sales were ebooks, and 60% were print books. So contrast that with only 21% ebooks in 19, 40% in 2020. The changes was much more dramatic even for university presses, where in 2020, the percentage of titles that we sold that were E was 36% versus 16% in 2019. So ebook sales for all UPs, 16% in 2019, 36% of those sales were ebooks in 2020. Not unexpected, but I think it was interesting to see that the percentage was, the growth of ebook sales was much higher amongst university presses than trade presses.
And Paige, maybe just to follow up on that question, I'm a bit curious because you mentioned earlier about the change, the shift in the models and what that's meant to the press. And from what I'm hearing that John said specific to academic libraries, is that shift of where it's been, obviously there's been an attrition of print over the years. It's been a bit, I think it's safe to say based on that data that it's been exacerbated by COVID. Does that mean when it comes to the difference between print and digital in the library market that a university press that's reliant on a third party has less of that connection to what's happening with their books, or does it offer the opportunity for more access?
Sorry, Steve, is that directed at me?
Sorry, I was asking Paige.
Okay, thanks.
I would say that allows for more access. I mean, perhaps Patrick can speak on it differently, but you know, I would say that just the ability to offer more of our titles in the variety of models, you know, and get that data back from the aggregators allows us to, you know, think at a higher level about these things.
Is that why you've made the decision in terms of digitizing more content? And Angela briefly talked about the pains of metadata and discovery. Have you been able to get to that level where you are thinking about specific for academic libraries, about the metadata, about discovery tools?
Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, I saw that, you know, Angela's quote comes from 2013, and, you know, the next year we had put a lot of resources into our publishing management system and improving the kind of metadata that was being sent out, and our relationship with, you know, BiblioVault is who we use to send out our Onyx feeds to the different distributors. And so we are constantly working with them to improve metadata and therefore discoverability. And also making sure that all of the vendors receive our content at the same time. It is always our goal to have our ebooks align with the publication date of our print books, and, you know, have it equitable across vendors. So no matter who the library is using for acquisitions, they will have access to our content.
Great, thanks, Paige. And
Steve, can I ask a question of Patrick and Paige? So when I read that quote about the low use scholarly monograph, you know, one reaction I had to that is, you know, we didn't need the opening up of all the coronavirus literature to learn this, but it reinforced it that when we open up content, it gets read. So there is a global readership sitting out there waiting to read these books, and we need to figure out how to put it in their hands. So to what extent, you know, are your presses thinking of, you know, ways to open up this content, and how are you thinking about that? Because I really do think that it is part of the answer to this problem, that this stuff does not need to be low use. I think maybe it's not going to be high use, but maybe it could be medium use. And I will just say from Iowa State's perspective, is our budget keeps getting cut, we are prioritizing keeping content that is open. And so content, your front list that we're buying through Gruyter's 2 or 3 years down the road, it's of diminishing value to us if it is not open. So I'd be really interested in hearing on what you're thinking as far as open models and what direction you're going with your presses.
Hey, Curtis, just a follow-up question on that. What role do you think academic research libraries play then? I mean, if we're saying that low-use scholarly monograph is not financially sustainable, and open access is a means to possibly support that. I know you can't speak for all of your libraries, but you know, this is a new area. This is not a heavily dominant area in the UP landscape. However, you are heavily invested and involved in this area. What kind of what do you think? Where do you see this a few years from now? What roles do ARL libraries play?
Yeah, and I do want to give them a chance to talk about what their open plans might be, Steve, but I would just say, if you look at what's happening in the journal space, 2 years ago, libraries were not making open access agreements on the journal side, and look at where we're at now. Cambridge University Press has now said within 2 to 3 years, they will fully move from the subscription model to their new open access read and publish. How are they doing that? They're signing up, you know, they started 2020 with 20 libraries on the journal side again. In their open access agreement, they ended 2020 with over 130 US libraries signed up. So I think there is an appetite with US libraries to invest in open content. That's on the journal side, that's on the book side. And I think that there is a huge advantage to presses that can move early into this space, as MIT and Central University, European University are doing. And I would just put it out there that it is something we really do not want to be paying for paywalled content going forward at Iowa State. And I do think more libraries are thinking this way.
That's a good segue into sustainability. And so the question is, you know, in this environment that we have from COVID now, and we're talking, you know, about 2020, we're talking about 2021. Paige, if you don't mind, I'll come back to you. Now, what kind of predictability does Harvard University Press have when it comes to ebook revenue? Can you predict library sales I mean, are you getting any predictive measures for single title sales, from demand-driven models of which you're heavily reliant on third parties, for front list and back list titles? How do you manage expectations with the press?
Yeah, I mean, predictability of revenue is a huge issue. And, budget and sales predictions for us for ebooks are done at a more macro level. And for our front list, this is just much more straightforward. It's easier to do for retail channels and assume a percentage of ebook sales based on our target and estimates for print. But with libraries and for our backlist, we just simply don't have the resources to be able to drill down into the different models and be able to also store this information year over year in our financial systems, our publishing management systems. So, as I said, we are reliant on data that we receive from distributors about these trends. And for a lot of our titles that become heavily used for course adoptions, this does not become apparent to us until many years out. So we try to paint a big picture of our sales and extrapolate from there. But this kind of data we receive from the vendors is what we use to manage budget expectations internally. But it is the predictability of those revenue streams that is so, in question every year.
And with the loss of course adoption sales, I mean, and I don't want to speak for you, but from what I'm hearing is that the shift where you have the shift from having some predictability with course adoption sales to losing access to exactly what type of revenue is going to be generated in other streams, that you have less access to that information, that then tells me that there's some risk, and that there's more risk now than ever when it comes to or less control in terms of how you manage your expectations and what you can expect. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it is. And, there's just the guessing game element and seeing what happens year over year with a specific title. And it could perform just 5 years down the line, but not so much in the first few years.
Right. And I'd like to bring in Brendan Coyne. Brendan is the Director of Sales and Marketing at Penn State University Press. Penn State University Press is a different group press than Harvard University Press with the AUP. Brendan, I'd like to ask the same question to you. What kind of predictability does Penn State have, and how do you manage expectations?
Thanks, Steve. I'll largely echo what Paige said. I was, I guess, pleased and disheartened at the same time to hear that Harvard has similar troubles with understanding and kind of predicting what e-sales to libraries look like, what they have been, and where they're going. It's something that's vexed us. I think at PSU Press, first off, I mean, we have long been print fetishists. We kind of ebooks were not as important to us, mostly given the tilt of our list, really heavily illustrated things like art history and that don't lend themselves well to digitization for many reasons. But we started to change that and to add some new, or get a little more aggressive about ebook sales in the before times. And we were seeing incremental and fluctuating, but increasing ebook sales into the library market, in various forms, whether we're talking single titles or more the kind of DDA based and less predictable sort of sales. And then the pandemic hit, and really, I mean, that's thrown everything into question. One of the things that we have seen is and heard is that the appetite for print books in the academic library market is small and shrinking, and it's probably stabilized at what I would say even pre-pandemic times was an unsustainable level, and is most certainly print sales only is just not for a monograph viable anymore. So when I try and look out in the future and I say, what's my, what are the next 3, 6, 12, 18 months of ebook sales, frighteningly, we don't have the level of data we need to be able to predict that and say whether a given book is actually going to be able to earn its keep or what portion of its keep it will earn. I mean, in reality, earlier, a couple of our colleagues who are librarians, spoke of the the various models. And I think John Elliott, I think that you also talked about that these were signs of good cooperation and collaboration between university presses and university libraries, and the proliferation of models and ways that libraries can get content for your researchers and the students that you serve. And while I agree with that on a certain level, on another level, it makes it impossible. And again, I appreciate that Harvard has these same troubles. It makes it nearly impossible for a university press to know what's actually going, to model what's going to happen. We can look at things at the macro level, as Paige said, but give me a title by title, or even like kind of subject matter or group list, and it's harder than the trade market, which, as Patrick mentioned early on, we just kind of aggressively decided to, during the middle of a pandemic, throw ourselves out in the trade market, because why not? But it's less predictable than the trade market now for me. I can confidently project what the Graphic Mundi titles are going to be, as long as I'm conservative. Ebook sales to the library market are, they are a black box, and I think that our partners, and we're excited to be working with Gruyter now, but our other ebook sales partners have been giving us, I think, robust information, but making sense of it, especially with fulfillment, kind of software systems that weren't built for this. Just it's guesswork, and that's the hardest part of this for me.
Thank you, Brendan. Angela said one of her quotes that we didn't touch on. She says, we have to come together and figure out sustainability. And I think, whether hearing from initiatives on open access, and then hearing and how libraries would like to see that in the future, also hearing about how presses have less ability to have predictable and albeit sustainable revenue streams. Bringing that together, obviously requires this type of session, this type of community-based and collaborative action. And so I really hope that this is the beginning of a lot more conversations. I think we could have. I think we in efforts to continue this discussion. Hopefully, we continue this discussion and continue to make progress in these areas. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for taking time to answer my questions. Now, I'd like to move to the questions from our attendees, and let me pull that up. And the first question as they come. Okay, the problem with presses spreading themselves on so many platforms is the lack of having one single place to complete collection of each presses. The issue of DRM is also not helping us in the libraries. I would also like to know why some presses are making available some of their ebooks on aggregators such as ProQuest and EBSCO before other platforms, and sometimes their own. This comes from Louis Hu from McGill University Press. Would anyone like to take a stab at answering that? Brendan or Paige?
I would say that certainly from our perspective, it's not our intention to have the content come out at different times. We work closely with our metadata distributor to make sure that doesn't happen. And I would say we'd made improvements on that in the last couple of years, and just making our content available simultaneously in print and and participating in lots of different platforms. The vendors themselves have different sales models, but we do try to make those titles come out simultaneously across the vendors.
Question for John from Louis as well. John, ebook sales increased dramatically for UPs in 2020 over in 2019. Did overall UP sales increase or decline? You mentioned the breakdown. In other words, a lot more ebook sales, but a very challenging year for UPs. Is that an accurate assessment overall?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I mean, sadly, there's not a lot of new money, right? So you're shifting it from print or to E, and certainly your dollar goes farther. When we look at unit sales overall, 2019 versus 2020, it's lower, obviously because ebooks tend to be pricier than print books, and so and that's obviously true for UPs as well. So yeah, the way you characterize it is correct, Steve, and I think that we did see lower overall unit sales as a result of the shift to E.
Another question for you, John, is do you view content from UPs differently than 1,000 commercial presses in terms of collection development strategy?
No, I from the standpoint of us doing our profiling, from the very beginning, and then the work that our collection development managers do in constructing those profiles, whether they're driving a print approval plan or an e-approval plan or a DDA program, EBA, et cetera, that, we really, our guiding principle is to leave it up to the choice of the library, what they want to see, when they want to see it, in what form, in what way, whether it's a notification, a print book, an ebook.
And John, it's safe to say that just based on the question, that from your perspective, you mostly, is it safe to say that you mostly have access to single title sales and revenue generated from demand driven, so approval plans, single title sales,
Right.
elected sales, and approval plans. Would you say that also as you don't have access to the collection data, is that a fair assessment that mostly what you're in a reference to this in the comparison between commercial presses and UPs is restricted to single title sales and approval plans and demand driven models?
Sure. If it's coming through an aggregator, or again, as you mentioned, as part of a collection, we have visibility in terms of the sale of the collection or a DDA trigger. But when we're sharing, a lot of that unique data that we have that a press might not see are those single title sales that we get, whether they're P. Presumably they would know if they're E, but particularly for the print sales, and that's really our publisher relations team spends a lot of time with the publisher partners providing that data. And even as as Brendan and Paige mentioned, it's really difficult to get your arms around it all from a budget perspective, or how a given title will perform. I think it's we do provide that data to our publishing partners on the print sales.
Yeah, and if I were to put my hat on as a partner slash aggregator and also as a publisher, what I see, as we are a publisher with GOBI, as well as working with them on an aggregator basis, is that those presses that don't have their platform, specifically addressing them,
Right.
is that the dependency on aggregation, the dependency on GOBI, there really isn't that counterweight to all of that commercial publishers have.
Right.
What are the revenue streams that come from outside of the single title or demand driven acquisition? And the lack of that counterweight, hopefully, is a discussion that we can have at another time in talking about sustainability. Another question from Mohammed Ahmed is, with ongoing budget cuts, how do you think it is sustainable for libraries to keep up with scholarly output, knowing that the cost of an e-copy of a book is 3 to 4 more times than that of the print copy? This may lead to bigger inequity collection issues in specific areas in the future, if not addressed by publishers and content providers. So this price disparity between print and digital. Patrick Alexander, could you speak to that, about that disparity?
I wish I could speak intelligently about it, but I would say that's a very interesting and challenging question. I think for publishers who didn't see the digital turn coming, we're kind of groping our way to try and find the right model for selling ebooks into the marketplace. 3 to 4 times doesn't resonate with our policy, but I'm sure there are presses out there that do. Ebooks are just as expensive to make as a print book, apart from the printing. And then there are other concerns that attend to the ebook publication that exceed what it costs to print a book, like maintaining the metadata, getting partners to send that metadata, making sure it's distributed properly. And so there's a lot of costs that I don't think people are aware of that attend to ebooks. So that's my best stab at that excellent question.
Great, thank you. Well, we promised a hard stop at 2 o'clock. It's now 1:58. Again, I'd like to thank all of our attendees that asked questions. You should know that we are going to take all of your questions. We'll make sure that if your question was unable to be answered, that we will coordinate with our panelists and we will get them answered and we will get you that information. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today. I'd also like to thank all of our panelists for taking time to answer all of our questions. Thank you very much. And then I'd like to turn it over to Caitlin for any additional details. Caitlin?
Yep, I just wanted to add that you will receive the recording and any unanswered questions in a follow-up emailing. And thanks again for joining us today, and we will see you next time.
Right. Thank you all.